Yes, history. That one school subject that takes you to death and back in the space of an hour by the sheer force of how boring your elderly teacher is. I bet that even now your head hurts at remembering all those names, places, and dates you had to memorize, only for the sake of getting a barely passing grade on your tests. So, I get it if you're a bit on the fence about learning history. After all, why should we care about things that happened a long time ago in faraway places, right? Shouldn't we be paying closer attention to what's going on right now? Well, I ask you to please bear with me for a little while, and I will try to convince you that there's way more to history than what meets the eye. I think a good place to start is by asking exactly what history is. If you were to ask the Merriam Webster dictionary, you would conclude that it's a chronological record of significant events, often including an explanation of their causes. And while that's certainly not wrong, it isn't exactly right either. And I'm not about to feed you a dictionary definition and call it a day. To truly understand history, we need to know that place is just as important to consider as time. We also need to be aware that what counts as a significant event varies widely depending on what we are studying at any particular time. More on that later. So, what do you think if we go ask some old man with funky facial hair what they thought? Well, dynamic duo Public Enemies Number 1 and OTP, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels said in the Satanic Bible, oh, no, sorry, the Communist Manifesto, that all of history is the history of class struggle. Now, you have probably heard that before by way of your pretentious cousin who is trying to sound smart, but let me explain to you what those two actually meant by that. Around the time that those two were around, the formal study of history was just beginning to take shape. Yes, there had been historical accounts since pretty much forever, but scholars hadn't really started to ask questions around history until Europeans with too much time on their hands like Voltaire, Kant, and Hegel came around. So, class isn't just a buzzword they used to point fingers at people and things they didn't like, but a fully developed concept that Marx and Engels understood to be a mechanism by which society drove itself, made up by well-defined and distinct groups of people who are often ignorant of the part they play in history, all of it driven by the control of the means of production and the products that they give. Bear in mind that this is but one definition of history, and my explanation of it is remarkably simple. But I think it illustrates the fact that the study of history is far more complex than just placing names and dates in a timeline. We historians don't think of history as just a bunch of events in succession, but if I were to use the words of a mad and wise man,
People assume that time is a strict progression of cause to effect, but actually, from a non-linear, non-subjective viewpoint, it's more like a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff.
this ball, which consists of processes that intersect and clash with each other all the time, is the mean by which we historians explain how humankind has developed its institutions, its governments, traditions, religions, and corporations, even its cultures, literature, music, etc., which have in turn become parts of a system that fits into itself and defines how and why things happen, when and where they do. But even more than that, if you were to ask what history is to an undergraduate student with a severe need for attention and a flair for the dramatic, I will say it's a tool. Let me keep running with that analogy and say that it's a Swiss knife. What I mean by that is that history has expressions and purposes only limited by human imagination. It can be used to understand current events, which are directly linked to those that happened before them. It is used every day at schools and churches to create national and religious identities. It can give a voice to minorities and make their suffering visible to themselves and everyone else. But it can also be used to legitimize the same actions and speeches that have caused said suffering. It can and does teach every single one of us who we are and where we came from. History is a double-edged sword that, when used consciously and honestly, can make us understand each other better, but can lead to bigotry and hate when those in control of the narratives wield it with ignorance and malice, which is why it's important for historical literacy to be encouraged. For said literacy to be achieved, we need to encourage skepticism and to be critical of our sources, and even historians themselves. We are by no means unbiased, and we all work from a certain position that makes being objective very difficult to achieve. While reading the work of any historian, it is important to ask ourselves who they were, what they thought, who was their original intended audience, what they hoped to achieve by writing what they did, why they picked the topics they did, what were the dominant ideologies during their time, what religion did they subscribe to, if any, and so on and so on. By the way, this is what we usually call historiography. Calling back to what I said earlier, the student of history must be aware of what is and isn't a significant event, which can be very tricky, because everything is and isn't significant at the same time. What I mean by that is that the relevance of an event is determined by what we are writing about and the audience we are trying to reach. For example, recording where Marsha P. Johnson was born might seem insignificant to the epic nationalist narratives that span centuries that a school textbook tries to tell, but it means the world to a history about the LGBTQ plus rights movement. Another important thing to keep in mind when we study history is that any knowledge that we have is hardly ever going to be complete. I like to visualize the work of a historian as similar to that of someone who is trying to fix something. For the sake of using another bad metaphor, let's think of a broken vase. When it's shattered and its parts scatter, some of them might have gotten lost, or they were so tiny that they couldn't be used again to fix the vase. So, whoever is getting the job done would be forced to leave the work incomplete or try to fill in the blanks as best as they could. Or you could, get a new vase, but that's not the point. I told you this was a bad metaphor. Historical reconstructions are very much like that. Sometimes we run into issues because a document might have gotten lost, or certain events and data simply were not ever properly recorded, which is why we often have to rely on second and third hand accounts, or documents that were written years after the event took place, and even indulge in educated speculation. We also rarely work alone, since some of those gaps in historical knowledge might even be filled with the help of archaeologists, sociologists, and anthropologists. We also must be very conscious of the fact that every event stands as a part of a greater whole. They are products of what happened before, forces of influence on what happened around them, and often causes for what happened after. If we were to take them in isolation, they would tell us next to nothing. Like, yeah, did you know the Australians lost the war against a horde of emus? Is a hilarious thing to say and a great icebreaker, but we can think of it as just something funny that happened once if we are to learn from it, or any historical event for that matter. My favorite crazy person with a funny mustache, Friedrich Nietzsche, wrote on his The Use and Abuse of History that we indeed do need history, but that it must be learned and taught in the service of life, not in the idle way that it usually is. He despised it when people taught history without any consideration for what I just said, or when scholars sat in their ivory towers and kept all their knowledge to themselves. Because, back then the only people who studied history were aristocrats with their lives secured, not a bunch of zoomers doomed to working at a subway. He encouraged that history was considered as an incredibly diverse set of worldviews, and that the meaning of it was relative to every person who seeks for it. Cultivating such a thing is the purpose of learning history. This all might sound like it's complicated, and like you need to be a scholar to even start considering getting into all this, but believe me, it is both way simpler than it sounds, and the entire purpose of me even doing this is to make this more accessible to everyone. We live in times that make it very easy for all kinds of information to be shared by all of us, and I have the hope of spreading what little knowledge I have to anyone who would listen. So please like, share, and subscribe. Also, comment what you would want me to talk about. I have already several things considered, but I would like to have an idea of what content you guys would like to watch. You can find me in Instagram and Twitter as Historic Historian, or hit the notification bell if you would want to know when my next upload happens. So yeah, thank you for watching the video all the way through. Don't expect all of my videos to be this way. This was only what I thought necessary. I thought it was important for me to get out there the way I think about history. But anyway, see you next time.